Lonely exiled soldier lived alone for years until a mail-order bride rejected. By everyone took his name. Bear Ridge, Wyoming, winter of 1887. The wind howled across the frozen prairie, rattling the frost-covered windows of the small wooden church at the edge of town. Snow dusted the ground, and the moonlight cast stark shadows through the bare cottonwood trees. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old hymnals and candle wax. The pews filled with townsfolk bundled in heavy coats, their whispers buzzing like flies. Rosalie Moore, 26, stepped through the creaking door. Her worn blue dress brushed clean, her dark hair pinned neatly under a faded bonnet. In her trembling hands, she clutched a crumpled letter, its ink smudged from months of travel across the plains. Her brown eyes, bright with hope, scanned the room for Charles Whitlow, the man who had promised her a new life, a husband's name in his letters. The crowd parted, their gazes sharp with curiosity. A baker's wife with pinched lips, a grizzled cattle hand with a smirk, and Mayor Harlan, his narrow eyes watching. From the back, arms crossed over his tailored vest. Rosalie's boots clicked on the wooden floor as she approached a tall man in a fine black coat. His blonde hair slicked back, a grin curling his lips. "I've come right on the day like you wrote," she said, her voice shaking but warm. The letter held out like a talisman. Charles Whitlow turned, his eyes glinting with amusement. "That letter," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Just a bet with my boys. Didn't think he'd actually show up." Laughter erupted from his friends. A group of rough men lounging against the pews. One, a horse trader with a scarred lip, Jared. "Good Lord, does this girl think she's marrying a Whitlow?" The baker's wife shook her head, her pity sharp as a blade. Rosalie froze, her breath catching, the letter slipping from her fingers to the floor, her eyes, once bright, turned hollow, her hands clutching the edges of her dress as the room spun with laughter. The door creaked again, and a heavy step echoed, silencing the crowd. Lucas Grady, 40, stepped into the church, his scarred face half hidden by the brim of his hat, his gray eyes cold as the Wyoming winter. He was a ghost in Bear Ridge. A former artilleryman exiled by his own guilt after a misfired cannon killed his fiancée Anna 7 years ago. The townsfolk called him the Silent Wolf. A man who spoke to no one, his presence a shadow at the edge of their lives. He had come to buy old harness straps from the church's storage, but the laughter stopped him cold, stirring memories of Anna's own humiliation years before. His boots thudded as he crossed the room, the crowd parting like water. He bent down, his calloused hands picking up Rosalie's letter, folding it with care as if it were something sacred. He held it out to her, his voice low but steady. "This doesn't belong on the floor." Rosalie's fingers brushed his as she took the letter, her eyes wide, searching his face for deceit. She found none, only a quiet strength in his gaze. The crowd murmured, the horse traders snorting, but Lucas ignored them, stepping closer to shield her from their stares. Charles laughed louder now, his voice cutting, "What's this, Grady? Playing hero for a nobody?" The mayor's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping his vest. Lucas turned, his gaze locking onto Charles, the air heavy with tension. "Lower your voice," he said, each word sharp as a blade. "She didn't come here to be insulted." The church fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. The baker's wife looked away, ashamed. The cattle hand's smirk faded. Rosalie clutched the letter, her breath shallow, her heart pounding with a mix of shame and something new. A flicker of safety in the shadow of this strange. Lucas gestured to the door, his voice softer now, meant only for her. "Come with me. You don't need this place." Rosalie hesitated, her eyes darting to Charles. Then back to Lucas. The mayor stepped forward, his voice smooth but cold. "Careful, Grady. You don't know what you're taking on." Lucas didn't flinch, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "I know enough," he said. He led Rosalie out into the biting wind, the letter pressed against her chest, the church's laughter fading behind them. The snow fell thicker now, and in the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing the resolve in Lucas's steps. Rosalie followed, unsure, but drawn to the man who had given her back a piece of her dignity, even if only for a moment. The Wyoming wind screamed across the prairie, clawing at the weathered planks of Lucas Grady's cabin on the outskirts of Bear Ridge. Snow swirled in the moonlight, piling against the cottonwood trees that stood like sentinels around the small wooden house. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and old ash. The fire in the stone hearth casting flickering shadows on the walls. Rosalie Moore sat on a creaking chair, her hands still clutching the crumpled letter, her eyes darting across the room. A charred picture frame hung above the hearth, holding a faded sketch of a woman with kind eyes. Anna, Lucas's fiancée, lost 7 years ago to his own misfired cannon. Rosal's fingers tightened on the letter, her body tense, wary of this stranger who had brought her here. Lucas, 36, stood by the fire. His scarred face half hidden in the dim light, his gray eyes unreadable. The townsfolk called him the Silent Wolf, a man who lived alone, spoke to no one, and carried his guilt like a shadow. Lucas stirred the fire, the poker scraping against the logs, sending sparks dancing. He glanced at Rosalie, her worn blue dress still dusted with snow, her dark hair falling loose from its pins. She looked small, fragile, but her eyes held a fire that hadn't been extinguished by the church's cruelty. He crossed to a wooden chest, pulling out a heavy wool coat, its edges frayed from years of use. He draped it over her shoulders, his voice low and rough. "You don't need their eyes on you." Rosalie flinched at the gesture, her breath catching, but the warmth of the coat eased her trembling. She studied him, searching for a motive, finding only silence and the steady rhythm of his movements as he set a tin plate of cornbread on the table, its edges uneven from his clumsy baking. "I don't cook well, but it's yours," he said, turning back to the fire. The cabin was sparse but clean with a single table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. A lantern hung from a beam, its weak flame swaying in the draft that slipped through the walls. Outside, the wind carried the faint howl of a wolf, a sound that made Rosalie's heart race. She stood, her boots scuffing the floor, the letter still pressed against her chest. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go. I've caused enough trouble." She moved toward the door, her hand on the latch, the cold air seeping through the cracks. Lucas didn't turn, his hands busy at a small workbench where he carved a wooden spoon, the knife moving with practiced care. The soft scrape of blade on wood filled the silence, blending with the fire's crackle. Rosalie paused, her eyes drawn to the spoon taking shape under his hands. The handle bore a simple pattern of stars etched with a precision that spoke of hours spent alone. Lucas looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. For the first time, steady and unguarded. "First time someone's been patient enough to sit at my table," he said, his voice soft but heavy, like the weight of years unspoken. Rosalie's hand dropped from the latch, her breath steadying. She saw the loneliness in his gaze, a mirror to her own, and the letter in her hands felt less like a chain. She stepped back, sinking into the chair, the coat still warm around her shoulders. The firelight danced across the charred frame on the wall, Anna's eyes seeming to watch them both. Rosalie's fingers traced the letter's edges, her mind replaying the church's laughter, the sting of Charles's words. Lucas set the half-carved spoon on the table, its stars catching the light. "Eat if you can," he said, nodding to the cornbread. "You're safe here." Rosalie hesitated, then broke off a piece, the act grounding her. Outside, the wolf howled again, closer now, and Lucas's hand rested on the rifle by the door, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the window. The townsfolk's whispers, "Silent wolf, killer, outcast," echoed in his mind. But Rosalie's presence, quiet and unbroken, stirred something he thought he'd buried with Anna. He turned back to her, his voice firm. "No one's coming through that door tonight." Rosalie nodded, her eyes softening, the letter slipping to her lap as she took another bite. The cabin, a fragile haven against the storm outside. The Wyoming dawn broke cold over Bear Ridge, the prairie cloaked in frost. The wind whistling through the cottonwoods around Lucas Grady's cabin. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a faint glow across the wooden walls where the charred frame of Anna's sketch hung like a silent witness. Rosalie Moore sat at the table, her hands trembling around a tin cup, her dark eyes red from sleeplessness. The crumpled letter lay beside her, its promises now a bitter weight. Lucas stood by the hearth, pouring warm water from a kettle into another cup, his scarred hands steady despite the tension in his broad shoulders. The townsfolk's whispers from the market echoed in Rosalie's mind. "The girl nobody wants. Whittles. Fool," each word a fresh cut. She set the cup down, her voice breaking as tears spilled over. "I just want someone to trust me. Just once," she said, her words raw, her hands clutching the edges of her worn dress. Lucas paused, his gray eyes softening, but he said nothing. He crossed to a wooden chest, pulling out a folded wool blanket, its edges woven with faded patterns of rivers. He placed it beside her, careful not to touch, and set the cup of warm water closer. Drink if you can, he said, his voice low. Rough from disuse. Rosalie wiped her eyes, her breath steadying, but the market's gossip clung to her like damp cold. She stood, moving toward the door, her boots scuffing the floor. I'm a burden, she said, her voice barely audible. I shouldn't stay. Outside, the wind carried the distant whinny of wild horses, their hoof beats faint against the frozen earth. Lucas led her to the yard, where a coil of rope lay beside a fence post. No burden learns this, he said, picking up the rope and showing her how to tie a cowboy's knot. His hands moving with quiet precision. The wind whipped through Rosalie's hair, chilling her cheeks, but she followed his lead, her fingers fumbling at first, then steadying as the knot took shape. The prairie stretched vast around them, the sky heavy with gray clouds, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Lucas watched her, seeing in her stubborn grip a strength like Anna's, a woman who had faced her own battles and never broke. He wanted to protect that fire, though he barely understood why. A horse's snort broke the silence, and Jake, a grizzled cattle hand with a weathered hat, rode up to the fence. His eyes narrowed at Rosalie, then fixed on Lucas. Heard Charles's sniffing around. Grady, he said, his voice gruff. Whitlow's boys were at the saloon talking about your guest. Watch yourself. Lucas's jaw tightened, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Let them talk, he said, his tone flat but firm. Jake shook his head, spitting into the snow. You're stirring trouble. Silent wolf, he rode off, leaving a trail of hoof prints in the frost. Back inside, as dusk fell, Lucas hung a small lantern by Rosalie's chair, its flame weak but steady, casting a soft glow across her face. It'll guide you if you go, but I hope you stay, he said, his voice almost lost in the wind's howl. Through the cabin's cracks. He placed a wooden spoon on the table, its handle etched with stars, freshly carved from the night before. This is for eating here, he said, his eyes meeting hers. A quiet plea beneath his stoic exterior. Rosalie's fingers closed around the spoon, its smooth grain grounding her, the weight of her shame easing under his gaze. The fire crackled, the wind rattling the windows, and Rosalie sat back down, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She watched Lucas at his workbench, carving another spoon. Under the flicker of an oil lamp, his hands steady despite the storm brewing outside. The wind carried the faint cry of a wolf, but Rosalie no longer flinched. She saw the stars on the spoon, the lantern's glow, and Lucas's silent resolve, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of belonging. Finally, she took a sip of coffee, inhaling the labored process, as if letting small exhales be exhaled from the air through the wall of her body before the flicker of belonging. I'll stay, she said, her voice soft but certain. The words sealing a quiet bond as the Wyoming night closed in around them. The fire in Lucas Grady's cabin glowed softly, casting shadows across the wooden walls where Anna's charred sketch hung quietly. Outside the Wyoming wind howled, carrying a wolf's cry over the frosty prairie. Rosalie Moore sat by the hearth, a wool blanket draped over her shoulders, her dark eyes fixed on the flames. My mother was a working girl. From Chihuahua, she said, her voice steady despite the pain. She taught me a song about desert stars guiding you home. Died sick when I was 12. Folks called me that horse girl, never. Rosalie. Her chin stayed high, defying the hurt. Lucas leaned against the table, his scarred hands still, his gray eyes on her. My mother was a Western woman, tough as nails, he said, his voice rough. Raised me alone, died poor. In a shack, never got her due. The wolf's howl rose, blending with the fire's crackle, their eyes met, a shared understanding binding two souls marked by twisted names. He motioned her outside, the air biting, the prairie vast under a cloudy sky. Lucas handed her an old rifle, its barrel worn but polished, and set tin cans on a fence post. You need to know this, he said, thinking of Charles Whitlow's lurking gang. He guided her stance. Without touching, his breath visible in the cold. Aim low, he said. Rosalie fired, missing, but kicking up dust, the wind whipping her hair. Lucas nodded, a faint smile forming. Again, he said, as wild horses in the distance. Back. Inside, Lucas carved a small wooden box under an oil lamp's flicker, etching RM into the lid with care. Rosalie watched, a tin cup of water in her hands, the cabin's warmth easing her chill. He set the box by her cot, his voice a whisper. Your name's Rosalie, not a curse. Her fingers brushed the initials, eyes glistening. The box, a quiet promise, stirring trust she hadn't felt in years. They returned to the yard, the wind sharper, dusk bruising the sky. Lucas stood close as Rosalie aimed the rifle. Breathe out, pull, he said. She fired. A can clattering off, the sound sharp against the wind. Their eyes met. Holding longer, the moment heavy with connection. The wolf howled closer, but they stood firm. Lucas saw Anna's strength in her, a chance to right his past. Rosalie felt his respect, a lifeline stronger than her old letter. The cabin's fire crackled as they stepped inside, the carved box gleaming in the lantern's light. Rosalie set it by her cut, fingers lingering on the initials. Lucas checked the rifle by the door, scanning the darkness for Charles's threat. You're not alone anymore, he said, his voice sure. Rosalie nodded, holding the box. Her name no longer a wound, but a new beginning, forged in the Wyoming night. Snow swirled across the Wyoming prairie. The wind howling through the cottonwoods. Around Lucas Grady's cabin, blanketing Bear Ridge in a bitter chill. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting a warm glow over the wooden walls where Anna's charred sketch watched silently. Rosalie Moore sat at the table, mending a torn shirt with careful stitches. The carved wooden box bearing RM resting nearby. The distant whinny of wild horses pierced the night, their hoof beats faint against the storm's roar. Lucas stood by the window, his gray eyes scanning the darkness, his scarred hands gripping the rifle. Jake's warning about Charles Whit lingered, and the fresh hoof prints in the snow near the fence confirmed trouble was close. A sharp knock rattled the door, followed by Charles's voice slurred with whiskey. Grady, Time to return our little gift. Laughter erupted from his gang, their shadows looming in the lantern's glow outside. Lucas stepped onto the porch. The blizzard cutting through his coat, his boots crunching in the snow. Charles, flanked by 3 rough men, grinned, his black coat dusted with frost. "Come on, silent wolf," he taunted, gesturing toward the cabin. "Hand over the girl. She's no use to you." The horse trader from the church smirked, his hand on a pistol. Rosalie stood in the doorway. Her breath catching, her hands clutching the frame, her dark eyes wide with fear. But defiance. Lucas faced them, his expression cold as the steel in his gaze, his voice low and steady. "If you insult the woman I live with, don't turn your back." The wind howled, carrying his words like a blade. The horse trader's smirk faltered and Charles's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. The gang shifted, their bravado shrinking under Lucas's unflinching stare. Without a word, they backed away, their boots slipping in the snow, their laughter swallowed by the storm. Lucas watched until their figures vanished, then turned to Rosalie, his face softening. She stepped back inside, her voice trembling but sharp. "Are you protecting me or yourself?" she asked, her eyes searching his, probing for the truth. Behind his stand. Lucas didn't answer. He crossed to the corner where a sagging wooden chair leaned against the wall, its legs worn from years of neglect. He knelt, his hands working with a small hammer and nails, tightening the joints as the fire crackled and the wind rattled the shutters. The chair creaked under his touch, but he worked with care, smoothing the wood with a piece of sandpaper. When he finished, he set it by the table, his voice quiet but firm. "This is for you, not me." Rosalie's breath caught, her fingers brushing the chair's arm, the gesture small but heavy with meaning. She stepped closer, her arms wrapping around him, her cheek pressed against his chest, the first time she let go of her fear. His arms hesitated, then held her, his scarred hands gentle, the warmth of the embrace a shield against the storm outside. The firelight danced across the cabin, the carved box gleaming on the table, the spoon with its star pattern beside it. Rosalie pulled back, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one's chosen me before," she said, her words raw, carrying the weight of years spent unwanted. Lucas looked at her, his gray eyes steady, the scar on his cheek softened by the fire's glow. "I'm choosing you now," he said, his voice a vow. Simple but unshakable. The words settled between them, a bond forged in the quiet of the cabin, stronger than the blizzard raging outside. Lucas returned to the window, checking the darkness, the rifle still within reach. The wild horses whinnied again, their calls echoing through the snow, a reminder of the untamed world beyond. Rosalie sat in the chair, her fingers tracing its smooth wood, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The storm battered the cabin, but inside the fire burned steady, the carved RM on the box, a testament to her place. Lucas glanced back, seeing in her the family he thought he'd lost. A reason to face the threat still lurking. Rosalie met his gaze, her fear replaced by resolve. Knowing she was no longer alone in the vast, cold Wyoming night. The Wyoming. Wind roared across the prairie, tearing at the shingles of Lucas Grady's cabin. The sky over Bear Ridge bruised with gray clouds. Inside the fire in the stone hearth cast a warm glow, its light flickering over the charred frame of Anna's sketch, and the wooden box etched with R.M. Rosalie Moore lay on the narrow cut, her face pale, a bruise blooming on her forehead from a fall while repairing the roof. She had climbed up in the gusting wind, determined to fix a loose shingle, but slipped, her ankle twisting as she hit the ground. Lucas had carried her inside, his scarred hands trembling, his gray eyes wide with a fear he hadn't felt since Anna's death. He sat beside her now, a damp cloth pressed gently to her forehead. The cabin filled with the scent of pine and the faint crackle of the fire. Rosalie stirred, her dark eyes fluttering open, wincing as she tried to sit up. Lucas eased her back, his voice low and rough. "Stay still," he said, his hands steady, despite the panic in his chest. He crossed to the table, picking up a scrap of paper where Rosalie had written the words to the Mexican folk song her mother taught her about stars guiding wanderers through the Chihuahua desert. He set it beside her, the paper crinkled but cherished, its words a piece of her past. Outside, a wolf's howl pierced the night, its cry sharp against the wind's wail, and Lucas's heart clenched. The fear of losing someone again clawing at him. He took a piece of charred wood from the old church, saved from the day he first saw Rosalie, and carved with his knife, the blade scraping softly. His hands shook as he etched words into the blackened grain. "I don't know how to love, but I'm scared of losing you." He placed the wood beside the cot, his eyes avoiding hers, his throat tight. Rosalie's fingers brushed the words, her breath catching as she read them, the firelight catching the tears in her eye. Lucas sat back, his voice barely audible, stumbling through the first lines of her folk song, his tone clumsy but earnest. "Sing it when you're better," he said, his scarred face soft in the glow, his attempt at the melody a quiet offering. Rosalie's lips curved into a weak smile. Her hand reaching for his, her touch light but certain. "Then learn," she whispered, her voice frail but resolute. "I'm not going anywhere." The words hung between them, a vow as strong as the Wyoming oak, sealing their bond in the cabin's warmth. Lucas's shoulders eased, his fear retreating, replaced by a resolve to hold on to this woman who had become his reason to live. Rosalie felt his sincerity, a lifeline stronger than the letter that brought her here. Her heart choosing to stay, to teach and learn, love with him. The fire crackled, its light dancing across the carved box. And the spoon with its star pattern. Lucas adjusted the blanket over Rosalie, his hands careful, the wolf's howl fading into the distance. He sat by the cot, his eyes tracing her face, seeing in her the strength to rebuild what he thought was lost forever. Rosalie held the charred wood, her fingers tracing his words, her smile steadying as the pain in her ankle dulled. The wind battered the cabin, but the warmth inside held firm, a haven against the storm. Lucas glanced at the rifle by the door, knowing Charles Whitlow's threat still lingered, but his focus stayed on Rosalie. Her presence a light he hadn't dared hope for. She closed her eyes, the folk song's melody echoing in her mind. And whispered, "We'll learn together." The cabin stood quiet, the fire's glow, a promise of something new, forged in the heart of the Wyoming night. The Wyoming moon hung low over Bear Ridge, its silver light spilling across the frost-covered prairie, illuminating the skeletal remains of the abandoned church. Lucas Grady led Rosalie Moore through the snow, their boots crunching in the snowness, the wind a soft whisper compared to the storms of weeks past. The church's weathered beams loomed ahead, its broken sign dangling from a single nail. Lucas had seen this place from afar the day he brought Rosalie home. Its ruin a mirror of his own until she arrived. Rosalie's hand rested in his, her dark eyes steady, the bruise on her forehead faded, but her resolve stronger than ever. The carved wooden box with RM sat in her coat pocket, a quiet reminder of her place. Lucas knelt by the church's entrance, his scarred hands working to rehang the sign he'd repaired. The words Hope's Chapel carved anew into the oak. The moonlight caught the fresh letters, making them glow. He stood, pulling a small wooden ring from his pocket, its surface etched with LL and RM, the lines delicate but firm. He slipped it onto Rosalie's finger, his voice low and steady. "This ring carries us both now," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers, the scar on his cheek softened by the moon's light. Rosalie's breath caught, her fingers tracing the carved initials. The ring, a symbol of a bond forged without a priest or vows. Rooted in the Wyoming earth. A soft step broke the silence, and Tala, an old Cherokee friend of Lucas's mother, approached, her silver braid glinting under the moon. She carried a small